Welcome to My Therapist is Out, an open space therapy collective podcast. We are your hub for queer and trans mental health care. Each episode, we will speak with one of our therapists or collective members and chat about a mental health topic using a queer lens. And I am your host, Renae Johnson, licensed professional clinical counselor, art therapist, and founder of Open Space Therapy Collective. Today, we are speaking with OSTC therapist Jenny Nigro, they, them. Jenny is an associate social worker and specializes in working with adults who are exploring their identity and gender, who are looking to process trauma and wanting to increase self-compassion. As we dive into today's topic, please keep in mind that this is a mental health podcast and we will talk about sensitive issues. If you would like to be informed of any trigger warnings, please read the podcast description. Hi, welcome to My Therapist is Out, an open space therapy collective podcast. And I am so stoked today because we have Jenny Nigro with us, who has officially joined OSTC as one of our therapists. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm super excited to officially be able to be a therapist with OSTC and really dive in a little bit more. So thanks, Renae.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about asexuality, and I feel like this one has a lot of misconceptions around it. And so we're going to pull it apart and poke at it a little bit and see what comes up. But I also think that this would be a good one if any of the listeners have any other questions about this or comments about it, to please let us know, because this is a topic that was requested by one of the listeners. And I think is a really good one because this one is really stigmatized for sure.
It definitely is. And like any sexuality or orientation, it's so broad that we for sure are not going to hit on everything. So would love to hear follow-up questions if there's something specific that we missed or that people just want to know more about.
Totally. Okay, let's set the scene. What, broad strokes, because this is big, so we're not going to catch everything like you said, but what is asexuality?
Well, in the simplest terms, asexuality is a sexual orientation in which a person does not feel sexual desire for another person. Mm-hmm. So folks who identify as asexual will often refer to themselves as ace. So when I talk about it, I tend to use that interchangeably with asexual. And in contrast to people who are allosexual, which is the opposite, they do not consciously feel desire or sexual attraction to other humans and don't want to engage in sexual relationships with them. That's kind of the basic definition you'll get if you Google it, which I may or may not have done just.
Yeah, it's, I like that you kind of brought up the spectrum of it, because people who identify as ace also won't always be at the far end of like, I've got no sexuality desires. This is not who I am or what I'm interested in. Sometimes there is some movement towards the middle or towards the gray a little bit. And that can vary a lot depending on the person. So that's a great description of the umbrella aceness. What's, and as you say that, I've got like client questions popping up in my head, but is it possible to be ace with some people, but not ace with other people? Like, where does that switch into low libido or lack of sexual attraction towards a certain type of person, or even like, and there's some demisexuals who get confused here, because a demisexual is somebody who it needs to get to know somebody and is attracted to the person themselves, not necessarily a body.
Right. It does get tricky trying to sort of wade through all these different particulars, but in general, just to clarify, demisexual is, like you said, someone who only experiences sexual attraction following like a deep connection with a person. And gray asexual or gray ace refers to anywhere along the line between like zero attraction in some specific circumstances to some specific people at some times and not others. And it's really one of those things where we're trying to like codify something that can't necessarily be codified. And because, you know, we're talking about this under the queer umbrella, I think it's okay that we can say we don't, you know, we don't necessarily have the language yet, or it's really one of those things that's up to the person experiencing it to define, as is anything. But I think especially this, because there is a lack of language and conversation around it at this point.
Yeah, that's a great point, because this, I feel like, is maybe one of the newest things in our queer community to really come up and be talked about as sexual identity, and not just shamed as like, you're bad at sex, you're a prude, you got low libido, you need to go to a doctor, you like all of these things that's stigmatized. And it's awesome that it's now like, no, this is just who I am and how I function. And I don't need to be in hookup culture to have a valid queer identity.
Exactly. Well, I do want to go back to what you said about it possibly being low libido. There are a lot of other reasons why someone might try to explain away their lack of sexual desire. And the key, I think, from my understanding, the way I understand it, is the key word is desire. So a person with low libido may want to engage in a sexual interaction, but just may not, like, their body may not be on the same page. A person who is celibate is choosing not to engage in a sexual interaction. A person who might have other barriers, such as trauma or things like that, again, don't necessarily impact the desire. So when we are talking about asexuality, that's the key thing to remember, is that it's more of a conscious choice. You know, an asexual person might choose to have a sexual interaction with someone, or they might not. And bottom line is, they don't really owe anyone an explanation for those choices.
Yeah, well put. That desire piece is integral here. And that desire, if you have a low libido, or if you have sexual trauma history, or you're abstaining for whatever other reasons, that desire doesn't necessarily go away. Or even if you've like stepped away from a sexual life, it's almost, it can get quieter, but your want it doesn't go away.
Yes.
Where I think in the asexual and like the gray ace place, it doesn't really get turned on, or that desire piece doesn't really exist.
Or it's extremely rare, unpredictable, maybe just has to be a very specific like set of circumstances. Oh, and I do want to mention that being asexual or gray ace, it doesn't mean that it simply means you don't want to engage in sex with another person. Like, asexual people do masturbate, or they can if they want to. They do. It's not that they don't ever feel like sexual beings. It's that the component of engaging in it with someone else is just not part of the equation necessarily, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. That's a great point. How would somebody, you've kind of already answered this, but like in somebody's experience, and as they're kind of asking themselves, like, you know what, maybe this fits me, what are some signs that may be popping up, or what are some feelings they have, or what are some like social engagement cues that might be coming up that would point to like, hey, maybe you're in the asexual side of things?
Well, I think one of the most common ones that people experience is maybe when they're younger, maybe young adults, if they are in a group of friends or friends are talking about sex and talking about it in a way that just doesn't really connect with the way someone is feeling, maybe they don't understand like what the big deal is about, why everyone is so obsessed with it, why it's like people's primary motivation to do things, or why people make certain choices. And I think for a lot of people, when they have that kind of initial moment, signals to them like, oh, I don't feel that way. And I think that's something that a lot of folks who identify as asexual have experienced, is just realizing that the way other people talk about sex and sexual relationships does not resonate with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a piece of this too where that reminds me of how when someone is ace, it can be a common experience to be like, well, but everybody else feels this way, so I feel like I should put myself in these situations, or okay, I'm going to put myself in a sexual situation, and maybe that'll turn me on, and maybe it'll come, and maybe it'll make sense and get there. And that kind of like putting yourself in these situations, hoping that it will kind of click on at some point, and it never really does. I think is also a common thing that I hear a lot. And then also trying to figure out, okay, like what does that mean that didn't that didn't go anywhere?
Yeah, I agree that is common, and it's analogous to someone who is attracted to the same sex trying to date the opposite sex because of heteronormativity or what have you, and then going through the motions, trying to convince themselves that it's something that they want or that they can at least handle, because like a lot of folks who are raised in a cishet society, we don't always realize we have the options to not want X, Y, or Z, or to want something that has yet to be identified.
The question that I hear a lot about is people who are ace is, can they be in love? Can they be in a relationship? Do they want a relationship? Which part of why I love that asexuality is becoming more of a conversation is it's also helping us pull apart romantic identities and sexual identities, because those are different things and they've been historically like lumped into one thing.
Yes, I totally agree. And as you said, of course, asexual people and people on the gray ace spectrum can be in love, can have romantic relationships. Some people are not romantically attracted to others, which I think is a different podcast about romanticism, which is comparable, but focused on romantic feelings instead of sexual. I think the other thing to remember is that not wanting sex doesn't mean you don't want intimacy, and that there are a lot of forms that intimacy can take, and that there are a lot of ways to be close and connected to someone else, and that many people on the asexual spectrum do want those connections.
Yeah, and that intimacy can be physical. Like it can be like cuddling and being really close and holding hands, and having physical intimacy doesn't necessarily mean that's sexual intimacy.
Right. Yeah, it can be, I mean, this sounds kind of oversimplified, but it can be whatever you want it to be.
Well, it's so like that's always such an important thing to say still, because I think, like you mentioned earlier, we're so conditioned in our cishet world that we don't realize the questions that we can ask, or like, and I think our job as therapists, one of the biggest pieces of it is making the unconscious conscious. And I think that's a big part of like our collective queer process, is like being able to pull these things out of each other's unconscious and be like, wait, let's talk about this thing and question this thing, and look at it from all angles and see what's actually going on and what people actually want.
Definitely. I agree. It's always so exciting to work with someone to ask questions that maybe they haven't asked themselves or that they haven't thought of asking or answering. And to really work to, I think also a lot of what we do as therapists is supporting people in creating their own narratives of their lives and their identities, especially for queer folks. And as you said earlier, asexual identity is slowly coming more into the collective conversation and consciousness. And so I think the more conversations we have, the better.
Yeah. Before we get deeper into kind of asexual relationships, I do think it might be important to pause and talk about how trauma and sexuality can show up and kind of look similar to this. Do you have any like examples that you would point to that might be more of a trauma response to sexuality versus asexuality?
That's a good question. It's going to look different for everyone. Someone, a person who is not asexual may start having sex with someone or engage in a sexual act and then experience a trauma response, which you can talk more about maybe what that might look like. But as we said before, the desire was initially there. Whereas an asexual person, they may be involved in a sexual act with someone, but it's not, I don't know how to explain that. Do you have any examples?
This is tough, right? And I think this is where a lot of the deeper work is. And I think, one way to think about it that's helpful for me when I'm working with this is, what is the emotional process for somebody when they're engaging in sex with somebody else? And for somebody who's asexual, again, different for everybody, but there can be a lack of emotion involved in it. It can be a very like conscious decision, and we're doing this thing, and it's thought through much more clearly. Where if it's a trauma response, the desire is there from the beginning, so we're already in an emotional space, and then that can switch to a variety of things, where it can switch to fear, or you can all of a sudden be totally shut down and shut off, or you can get flashbacks can be an extreme reaction, but even just like memories, or like somebody starts floating in your mind, or a period of time starts kind of popping up, and it, like a distraction can even, like you can be distracted and pulled out of the room. And so one way that's helpful in this process of exploring it is like, okay, let's take the sex act out of it and let's look at the emotion engagement that's happening through this process. And ace people tend to be able to, if they're choosing to engage sexually with somebody, they tend to be able to stay in the room and be aware of what's happening, even if they're in a place where they're like, oh, maybe I'm not really into this. That like, fuck, I need to get out of here response tends not to show up as much. Does that sound resonate with you in your experience, or is?
It does, yeah. I think that's a really good explanation and a good way to look at it.
So if you are in a relationship with somebody and you are a sexual person, and you find out, or the partner finds out that they're an asexual person, how can some of those boundaries be talked about? How can the romance stay there if both partners are interested? What are some options that couples or poly people can do in these situations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question, because it happens all the time when, people are in relationships and their desire or where they're on the spectrum doesn't necessarily align. So communication, of course, is number one. And consent is also number one. They're both number one.
Partner number ones for our partners.
Exactly. Communication and consent, always, always, always. And like you said, discussing boundaries. And I think for the partner who is not asexual, it's important to be open, supportive, to really listen to what's being said and to understand that it's not a rejection. It's an inherent part of your partner's sexuality, the same way that being queer, whoever they're attracted to may be. And to just really be willing to engage in that conversation with them with an open mind, and see how you can work out where your boundaries are and what you both want.
Yeah, I think this too is one of those really great places where being able to look at the relationship and from different angles and make the relationship what you want and what works for both people. Just because one person is ace doesn't mean that the other person has to act ace, and vice versa. Just because one person is sexual doesn't mean the other person has to act sexual. And so really saying, okay, what it is it about each other that we're into, and why is this working and great, and what do we both need in a relationship that this dynamic isn't providing, and how do we supplement that?
Yeah, exactly.
Any other closing thoughts about asexuality? I mean, I think we, even in talking, I'm like, oh, we need to talk about demisexuals, and we need to talk about romance versus sexuality, and I feel like we came up with 10 more topics, but
it's always box once you start. I think it's not always crucial to put a label on yourself. It can be helpful. It can help you find community. It can help you to articulate your wants and needs. And also, I always find it helpful to understand that labels can shift and change over time. The way you feel might shift and change over time, or it might not. Every ace identity is valid, and you have a place in the queer community as a person who is ace. And that's really
yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. That's beautifully put.
That's it.
That's it. Yeah. Valid and fluid, and allowing yourself permission to label yourself if that works and not if it doesn't. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you've joined us, and we're going to hear so much from you more. And in the meantime, you can find us on all the social medias, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, you name it, Open Space Therapy or Open Space Therapy Collective. And we will be back in a couple weeks. Thanks again.
Yay.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. If you're in California looking for a therapist, visit our website at openspacetherapycollective.com and book a free intro call with one of our therapists to see if we're the right fit for you. My Therapist is Out is an Open Space Therapy Collective podcast. Our therapists are Kristen Crow, Debbie White, Jenny Nigro, Tara Friedman, and Renae Johnson. Our admin and communications coordinator is Riley Andresen. Our podcast editing is done by Smash and Grab Studio. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's topic. Leave us a comment below or email us at info@openspacetherapycollective.com. You can find us on TikTok at Open Space Therapy and on YouTube and Instagram at Open Space Therapy Collective. If you're enjoying My Therapist Is Out, please rate, comment, and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening.